Due to the nature of the content of this episode, if you are listening around small children, please use discretion before listening.
Welcome to the Beyond the Basics Bible Study Podcast. My name is Dan Snyder, and I am your host. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond the Basics, where we are exploring the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, one chapter at a time. Before we get started, if you enjoy the show and want to help keep it on the air, you can go to my website at beyondthebasics.blog. Click the donate button at the top, and that will bring you to the website for Passion for Life Ministries, where you can make a tax-deductible donation. Passion for Life is a ministry that I've partnered with that is dedicated to spreading the gospel and feeding the elderly in Central and South America. Please make sure you designate your gift for Beyond the Basics. You can also click the subscribe button, which will bring you to my Patreon page. And for only $4 a month, you can receive access to the full uncut episode, which will include between 10 and 30 minutes of additional audio. You will also receive access to all past episodes, starting with Genesis chapter 24. Now, onto the show. You know, there's all kinds of injustice in the world today. It's always been that way. Crime, corruption, poverty, false accusation, oppression. Maybe you've even faced some of that injustice in your own life. But you know, how we deal with injustice reveals our faith in God. When we face injustice, do we continue to act righteously? Do we continue to work hard? Do we trust that God has placed us in that difficult situation for a reason? You know, the Bible shows us all over the place that God will place us in unjust situations, not only for our own benefit, but for the good of God's plan, for God's glory. Do we trust that God knows what He's doing in those situations? I think many times our tendency is to pray and ask God, remove this situation from me. Remove this circumstance from me. Take me out of this situation. Take me out of this injustice. But instead, maybe our prayer should be, Lord, I trust you. And however long I'm here, I choose to live in righteousness and holiness and devotion to you. Now, Joseph in this chapter, in Genesis chapter 39, is going to face that very situation where he is placed into an unjust situation by God. How is he going to respond? What is he going to do about it? Well, we're going to find out as we go through the chapter. So let's get into verse 1 here. And it says that, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. Now, that phrase brought down is a comparison to verse 1 of chapter 38, when Judah went down from his brothers. The comparison is that they both had an elevated position in Jacob's family, and now they both are demoted. So if you remember from the previous episode, I mentioned that when Judah went down from his brothers, it was a word picture of a moral descent. It also indicates that Judah, who had been the rightful heir to Jacob's family because of what his three older brothers had done to forfeit the birthright, Judah was now the rightful heir, the one receiving the birthright, but he left, possibly because of feeling guilt at what he had done to Joseph, but he left. And he went down from his brothers, indicating the moral descent of his life from that point on. And we went through that in the last chapter. Now, in this chapter, Joseph, he didn't go down like Judah. He didn't make the choice to go down, but instead he was brought down. And so that's where the contrast is. Joseph had been elevated because he was his father's favorite son, and he had been the chosen heir, even though ultimately, he would not become the heir that would be given to Judah, but he would be the chosen heir at the time by Jacob. And now Joseph was demoted from that position because he had been kidnapped and sold into slavery by his brothers. But this is going to reveal the contrast between Joseph's and Judah's life. Judah is marked by moral depravity, a descent into the moral darkness of the Canaanites, whereas Joseph is being brought down against his will into the land of Egypt. And where Judah assimilated into the Canaanite lifestyle, Joseph is going to be a light in the midst of the darkness in the land of Egypt. So we're told that he's brought to Potiphar, which means devoted to the son, and he was an officer of Pharaoh. So we're told that he is the captain of the guard. So essentially he was the head of the secret service of ancient Egypt. He was in charge of the protection of Pharaoh. So in verse 2, we're told that the Lord was with Joseph, which means he went down to Egypt with Joseph. Just like the Lord went with Joseph's father, Jacob, even when Jacob didn't even acknowledge it, the Lord is now going with Joseph down to Egypt. So God didn't abandon Joseph, but he was more interested in preparing Joseph for the future than he was in Joseph's happiness or comfort. So he didn't change Joseph's circumstances, but he brought Joseph's success in the midst of circumstances. But it's comforting to know that God did not abandon Joseph. And this phrase is repeated 4 times in this chapter, the phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. In fact, the word the Lord, or Yahweh in Hebrew, is repeated 7 times in the chapter. So the phrase, the Lord was with Joseph, being repeated 4 times, indicates that God's plan to bless the nations through Joseph will be completed through what he does in this chapter with Joseph and in the coming chapters. It means that God's hand is on him. It means God's hand is on every event in this chapter. And the name Yahweh being repeated 7 times, it emphasizes God's covenant name. That's what that name Yahweh is. It's his covenant name. That should bring to mind his faithfulness and his mercy. So despite Joseph facing these extremely difficult and oppressive conditions in his life, extreme injustice, we're reminded as we read that God is faithful to his promises, God is merciful, and will show mercy not only to Joseph, but to the whole world, or at least the entire Egyptian world and the Near Eastern world at the time. As we'll find out in several chapters, there's going to be a famine, and Joseph is going to end up bringing deliverance to the entire Near Eastern world through the wisdom that he receives from the Lord. So let's move on. In verse 3, it says, his master saw that the Lord was with him. Well, let's back up. Back to verse 2. It says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Joseph had been successful because the Lord had been with him. And in verse 3, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph's integrity and hard work was a testimony of God, even to the pagan Egyptians. This is what I want us to see here. This is very important. If we can remain faithful, if we can remain hardworking, if we can continue to have integrity and walk in humility in the midst of injustice and persecution, it becomes a testimony even to those around us who do not believe. It's so easy, especially in this culture, for us to want to cry out, for us to speak up, for us to want to protest, for us to want to do all sorts of things to bring attention to our cause and to the injustice that's being brought against us. But that's not what Joseph did. Instead, he put his head down and he worked hard and he stayed faithful and he stayed righteous. Now, what I'm not saying, I want to be clear about this, I am not saying that we shouldn't speak up for others who are facing injustice. That is absolutely not what I am saying here. We should absolutely speak up and help out and do what we can for those who are facing injustice, for others. That's called loving your neighbor. When another person is facing injustice, especially when that person can't speak up for themselves, we should speak out. We should do something. But when it comes to ourselves, the tendency in this culture, and it's under the masquerade of, like I mentioned, bringing attention to our cause, all it truly is complaining when it comes to our own situation. And Joseph here did not complain about his situation. We should not complain about our situation. So I want to be clear about that. There's a difference between complaining about the situation that we find ourselves in, masquerading as bringing attention or raising awareness. There's a difference between that and actually speaking up for those who cannot speak. So in verse 4, Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, meaning Potiphar, and he made him overseer. Potiphar made Joseph overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Joseph now became the highest ranking slave. But Joseph had to be a servant before he could rule. And this isn't always going to be a linear path. It doesn't mean that You're a servant and you slowly work your way up until you can rule. This isn't a corporate ladder that we're talking about here in God's kingdom. Sometimes there's ups and downs, because the purpose of this is that we need to learn to obey before we can lead. Jesus talks about this as well. In Matthew 25:21, he's telling a parable about a master and some servants, and he gave the servant some money to invest while he was gone, and the first servant comes back and shows his master that he had doubled the money, and his master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." So the servant was faithful with the little amount of money that his master had given him, worked hard, he doubled the money. Now his master rewards him and sets him over much more. And in Matthew 20, verses 25 through 28, it says, "But Jesus called them and said, You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So Jesus gave us this example of being a servant, of giving his life so that others could live. And we're to follow this example. If we want to be first, we need to be slave to others. If we want to be great, if we want to rule, we need to be a servant. That should be our mindset through our entire lives. And here's the thing, in the eyes of the world, that's usually not going to get you very far. If all you do is just serve, don't do it with the purpose of trying to get others to notice you, but do it for the purpose of the good of others, the world might not notice. The world might not care. But God sees, and he cares, and he will reward those who have that mind of Christ, to be a servant to others who love their neighbor. So in verse 5, it says, "From the time that he made him overseer in the house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house." So this actually points toward the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, which, if you remember, in Genesis 12:3 says, "I will bless those who bless you. To him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Even though Joseph was a slave, and a slave that was owned by this Egyptian, the Egyptian treated him well and made him overseer and blessed Joseph, so he was blessed by God. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. Not only that, but he blessed his house through Joseph, who was the descendant of Abraham, because the entire purpose of the covenant is to bless all the families of the earth. And so this is a little taste of that happening here. We get a little taste of it. So in verse 6 it says, "So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge." Continuing in verse 6, "Because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate." And the reason Potiphar was only concerned about the food he ate is because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews. So what do we see in these first 6 verses? We see that God takes an active role in Joseph's story. We're going to see this in several ways. In verse 2 and 3, it says that the Lord was with Joseph. We're told this twice in verses 2 and 3. So he became successful. Joseph didn't pout or feel sorry for himself, but he went to work and he did the best he could. Joseph became successful because the Lord was with him. And in verse 3, we're told that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Everything that Joseph put his hands to prospered. Everything he tried, everything he attempted, the Lord caused it to succeed. And then in verse 5, we're told that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. Even though Potiphar was pagan, highly unlikely that he would have worshipped Yahweh, his wealth still increased. He was still blessed because of Joseph. And God did this. God is the one who is responsible for all of this. But it's important to note that Joseph took an active role as well. Joseph had to do the work. Joseph didn't just sit back and wait for God to do something. He went to work. Essentially, he partnered with God to the point that we can say that God and Joseph did this together. God took his role. Joseph took his role. Joseph's role was to serve. Joseph's role was to trust. Joseph's role was to work. God's role was to make all of that work into something. So at the end of verse 6, we're told that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now the story shifts. We see success, we see blessing, we see Joseph working his way up, we see Joseph being rewarded. Then we're told that he's handsome in form and appearance. So in verse 7 it says, after a time, or immediately after these things, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph. So his status of being the overseer of the house, combined with his looks, drew the attention of Potiphar's wife. And she said, lie with me, to Joseph. The second reason we have this contrast here is that it highlights the contrast between man's role and God's role. The previous chapter shows God protecting the covenant. Remember, Judah did everything he could to completely destroy the messianic line. He married a Canaanite woman, had 3 sons with her, and God had to take extreme measures, including killing 2 of Judah's own sons, in order to protect the covenant and in order to protect this bloodline for the Messiah. That was God's work on display. That was God's power on display in the previous chapter. God was stepping in himself personally to take control of this situation that had become completely out of control because of Judah's own sin and compromise. But in this chapter, it's going to highlight how Joseph and his obedience, integrity, and surrender can bring about God's purposes. So in the previous chapter, God himself is protecting the covenant. In this chapter, Joseph's obedience and integrity is protecting the covenant. Notice what these 2 chapters, Genesis 38 and 39, are revealing to us, the reader. We do not get to just sit back and wait for God to show his power. It is working in partnership with the Lord. It is we do our part and God does his part. Our part is to remain faithful, to work hard, to walk in humility and justice. God's part is to take that which we sow and to reap a great harvest. So that's the very clear contrast between this chapter and the last chapter. Obviously, in the last chapter, Judah ended up preserving the covenant by sleeping with his daughter-in-law, who was dressed up as a prostitute. He essentially did it by accident, and only because of God's extreme intervention in the story. Here, Joseph is going to preserve the covenant by not sleeping with a woman trying to seduce him, and instead remaining faithful and holding on to his integrity. Because giving into sexual sin in this way was actually greater danger to him than being thrown in a pit by his brothers. Proverbs 23 verse 27 says, "For prostitute is a deep pit, and adulteress is a narrow well." Meaning the temptation, giving into the temptation of sexual sin is a deep, deep pit that will lead to the grave. Once you go down that road, it's impossible to get out. If you remember, I talked about 2 chapters ago, I talked about that the cistern, the pit that Joseph would have been thrown into, it's impossible to get out without help. You cannot get out. It's too deep, it's too narrow. That's what this proverb is talking about. It's a deep pit, it's a cistern that you cannot get out without help. So why did Potiphar's wife even try to do this? She may also have thought that she could command Joseph because he was a servant and he would just obey. So she may have thought that she had power over Joseph to make him do this thing. But as it turns out, Joseph refuses in verse 8. And he refuses for 3 reasons between verses 8 and 9. The first reason is that his master has put everything that he has in my charge. He didn't want to betray his master's trust. Joseph was in charge of the entire house, obviously except for Potiphar's food, and he valued that his master trusted him. He valued that Potiphar trusted him, and he didn't want to betray that trust. So he starts off with something very practical. And his second reason in verse 9, he says, "Nor has he kept back anything from me except you," obviously because she was Potiphar's wife. Joseph had access to everything else in the house except for Potiphar's wife, which means these were very explicit instructions because Joseph says he has not kept anything back except for you. And then at the end of verse 9 he says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So even if he could get away with this, of sleeping with Potiphar's wife, he knew that it would still be a sin against God. it shows that Joseph cared about more than just what he could get away with. So this is a good model for how to resist sin for us. We can learn from how Joseph refuses sin and use this same model. We can recognize how it affects others. Second, he didn't negotiate with temptation. He didn't give in to a little bit. He didn't go right up to the line without crossing it. He wasn't like Eve, who had a discussion with the serpent about whether or not it was right for her to take the fruit and eat it. He just simply said, "This is not right. I'm not going to do it." He didn't negotiate. And third, he was clear, and he didn't try to be diplomatic about it. He wasn't concerned about hurting Potiphar's wife's feelings. He was clear. He said, "I'm not going to do this. This is sin, and I'm not going to do it." And he didn't try to salvage a friendship out of it. He didn't try to make her feel better about what she asked him to do. But in verse 10, even though Joseph was very clear that this was sin and he wasn't going to do it, we're told that as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her. So she continued to ask day after day. Now, the text doesn't tell us how long Joseph had to resist her, but it was at least several days, maybe more. And it says he would not listen to her. He wouldn't compromise his integrity for his master's wife. In verse 11, one day when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house. So because Joseph always avoided Potiphar's wife, now she's come up with a plan to corner him. And that plan includes no one else being in the house. No one else can witness what happens. And we're told she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand because he had left in such a hurry, and he fled and got out of the house. So this is the second time Joseph has now left his garment behind. Both times resulted in him being imprisoned. The first time is when he left his coat that he had been given by his father, when he was thrown in a pit and imprisoned and then sold into slavery, and now he left his garment behind again, resulting in him eventually being thrown into prison by Potiphar. But the important thing is that he fled from sexual immorality, which is what we're to do. So in verse 14, Potiphar's wife called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." So now she's including the servants as victims of Joseph's alleged assaults. She's saying, Potiphar brought this Hebrew in here to laugh at us. Guys, look at what he's doing. He's laughing at us. He's mocking us. Now, this is another way that this chapter contrasts with the previous chapter, because in Genesis 38, in the previous chapter, in verse 23, Judah replied, when his sexual sin was found out, he replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." So Judah was afraid of being mocked if his sexual sin was found out when he slept with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. He was afraid he was going to be laughed at by others. He was going to be mocked. But now Joseph is falsely accused of sexual sin for the purpose of mocking Potiphar's wife. See, Judah was afraid of what people would think of him if his sin was found out. Joseph was not afraid of what people would think of him for resisting sin. So in verse 17, Potiphar comes home, and she told him the same story, saying the Hebrew servant, which is all she could call him because she couldn't use his actual name. She probably felt a tinge of regret, possibly, knowing her, or at least trying to dehumanize Joseph a little bit, because she knew that her false accusation would likely result in Joseph's death. This was an offense punishable by death. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, adultery was punishable by death. Prostitution was legal, but adultery resulted in death. And that was going to be the result for Joseph here. She says, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me." So now she's blaming Potiphar for bringing Joseph into the house. She's saying, "This is your fault. You brought this Hebrew into this house. Now he's here to mock me." So in verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. Because he knew Joseph's integrity, he may have even known that his wife was lying. But it's an impossible situation for him, because either he believes his wife and loses the man who ran his household, or he believes his servant and he loses his wife. So in verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison. There's no indication here that Joseph tried to defend himself, but this is the second serious injustice against Joseph. Previously, his brothers acted out of jealousy because of Joseph's immature prodding through his dreams, telling them of his dreams, constantly poking and prodding at them. But this time, Joseph shows maturity and resists wickedness and is still punished. So this is The second time that serious injustice is being brought on Joseph. See, his resistance to sin resulted in persecution, and we need to be prepared for this. There is going to come a time, I believe, in this nation, in the United States, and if you're listening in another country, it may already be in your nation. There is going to come a time in the United States where I'm hosting this program that our resistance to sin is going to result in persecution. Now, I mentioned that it's possible that Potiphar did not believe his wife, and this is why. Because he's put into prison rather than killed. So this is probably mercy being shown on Potiphar's part, because he could have put Joseph to death, and should have, if he actually believed that Joseph committed adultery. And in verse 21 it says, "The Lord was with Joseph, once again, and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." That word steadfast love is love that endures, and it results in our own endurance. The steadfast love of God, when we recognize and understand and experience his steadfast love, it results in our own steadfastness, our own endurance. Hebrews 10, verses 32 through 36 says, "But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised." This is speaking about saints that have been persecuted endlessly. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, what you need is not more stuff. What you need is not political power. What you need is not revenge against those who have come against you. Instead, what you need is endurance, to continue to endure persecution so that one day you will receive the promise of God. And that endurance comes through experiencing the steadfast love of God, the enduring love of God. The love of God that goes with Joseph in all the injustices that he faced, and that goes with us in all the injustice that we face. In verse 22, we're told the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So now, Joseph is now in charge of the prison that he was put in. So God is using these situations to refine his administrative skills so that one day he can administrate a nation that's going to provide salvation to many nations, as we will see in the coming chapters. So how does this chapter point to Jesus? Well, we know from 2 chapters ago that Joseph foreshadows Jesus. And Genesis 37 showed several different ways that Joseph foreshadowed Jesus. This chapter, there's several more, and we're going to go through those. So first, Joseph was obedient when facing injustice, and Jesus as well was obedient when facing injustice. Philippians 2:8 says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Joseph faced injustice for the purpose of saving the world. Same with Jesus. Isaiah 53:4-6 says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Joseph was tempted to sin, just like Jesus was tempted to sin in Matthew 4:1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Notice also that Jesus was led by the Spirit to be tempted. We often don't think of God being responsible for these situations where we're tempted, and God certainly is not the tempter, but he will very often put us in these situations where we will be tempted. Jesus was led by the Spirit. God was responsible for bringing Joseph into this situation where he would be tempted. But Joseph resisted temptation just like Jesus resisted temptation. In verse 10 of Matthew 4, it says, "Then Jesus said to him, 'Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve.'" So Jesus resisted temptation from the devil 3 times while he was in the wilderness, successfully resisted all 3 of those temptations. Joseph was falsely accused. Jesus, of course, was also falsely accused. In Mark 14, verses 55 through 56, "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree." Joseph's robe was stripped from him. Jesus' robe was also stripped from him. In Matthew 27, verse 31, "And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him." Joseph didn't defend himself against his accusers, and neither did Jesus. In Isaiah 53, verse 7, the prophet says, "He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." And then in Matthew 27, verses 13 through 14, that prophecy is fulfilled. It says, "Pilate said to him, 'Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?' But he gave him no answer." Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. And finally, Joseph was punished for the sins of others. Jesus also was punished for the sins of others. In Isaiah 53:5, it says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." So with that said, I want us to meditate on this week. This question is of how am I conducting myself in my life, whether I'm facing persecution or not. How are you conducting yourself? Are you conducting yourself with integrity, with humility, with faithfulness? And can others see that? And then do some soul searching. If persecution were to come, would you be able to sustain that? How would you be able to sustain that? What is it that creates endurance in us? What is it that creates endurance in the face of persecution and in the face of trouble? So meditate on those questions this week. Meditate on this chapter. Meditate on Joseph's response to injustice, and meditate on God's response to Joseph's actions. And let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this chapter, this opportunity to go deep into your word and discover all the riches that you have for us as we meditate on your word. God, though many of us that may be listening in the Western world do not face serious persecution, there are many of our brothers and sisters worldwide that are. Pray that you would give them endurance. Reveal to them your steadfast love, that they would remain humble and faithful to the end. And for those of us who are not currently facing persecution, for those of us who are not currently facing significant injustice, pray that you would do the work now in our hearts that would create endurance. Pray that you would do the work now, that you would prioritize our maturity in our lives rather than our happiness, so that when the trouble comes, so that when the injustice comes, we will be able to face it with integrity, with faithfulness, with endurance, and with the strength of the Holy Spirit in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. As always, I want to hear from you. I want to hear your feedback, good or bad. Go ahead and leave me a comment on social media or on the website, beyondthebasics.blog. Don't forget to press that like button or the subscribe button or follow button or whatever it is on whatever podcast platform you're using. And as always, leave me a 5-star rating. Help spread the word of the show so that hopefully more people can be blessed by it. Thanks again, and talk to you next week. Don't forget, if you enjoyed the show and would like to help keep it on the air, go to www.beyondthebasics.blog and click the donate button to make a tax-deductible donation. Make sure you designate the donation for Beyond the Basics. You can also click the subscribe button, which will take you to my Patreon page, where for only $4 per month, you can receive access to an additional 10 to 30 minutes of audio content per episode, as well as access to all previous episodes I've released.